Jones and Credlin.
Well, thank you for joining us. Now, look, what the hell is going on with China? I'll tell you something. Things can't go on the way they are. The Prime Minister said at the end of last week, we'll always stand our ground when it comes to the things that we believe in and the values we uphold, unquote. That prompts the question, what price are we prepared to pay to maintain our sovereign values in dealing with China? We've noted the editor of the Global Times, the leading Chinese Communist Party publication, describing us as, and I quote, pieces of chewing gum on the sole of China's shoes. Last week we had threats by China to bury Australian barley and meat exports. China have already slapped an 80% tariff on barley exports. But when you have the Chinese Communist Party rag, the Global Times, telling us we're pieces of chewing gum on the sole of China's shoes, and then the same newspaper talked about threats to Australia's $63 billion iron ore exports only a week after, a tax on beef and barley producers, which of course threatens the livelihoods of thousands of Australians in regional and rural Australia, something has to give. Now, it's not just Australia. Denmark, France and Germany have been threatened by China with serious trade repercussions if Huawei's 5G ambitions in Europe are not honoured. In Germany, the Chinese ambassador warned that German cars could be, quote, deemed unsafe by Chinese authorities, unquote, unless Huawei is given the green light. Sweden's been warned of consequences if it awards a dissident Swedish-Chinese publisher a prestigious literary prize. The Chinese ambassador to Sweden told Swedish public radio in November, listen to this, quote, we treat our friends with fine wine, but for our enemies we have shotguns. And yet now the apologists, and we've got them here in Australia, say, oh, we must shut up about the pandemic. All this is fascinating to one backbencher who's not found much favour with the leadership of the Liberal Party. Fierravanti-Wells, a New South Wales Liberal senator since 2005. And since 2018 at least, she's been out of favour with the coalition and banished to the backbenches. She was the Minister for International Development and the Pacific, and she was banished for her comments made about China. She was talking about China's manoeuvring within the Pacific. She talked about debt trap diplomacy. In other words, pile on enough debt to sovereign nations in the Pacific, and they'll always be satellites of China. Way back in 2018, she was taking a tough stance on all of this and was rebuked by many on her own side. She said in September 2018, quote, the high debt to gross domestic product ratio of various Pacific Island countries is of genuine concern. The issue that she was raising is absolutely spot on, and she called this out as Beijing were putting pressure on the Pacific Islands to back China's communist regime and agenda. She said back then, and was condemned for saying it, we need to watch out. Well, the bully boy stuff continues. Only today, the Chinese embassy in Canberra gave Prime Minister Morrison a disgraceful slapdown, saying it was a joke for Australia to claim it's been vindicated by international support for a coronavirus inquiry. Now, the World Health Assembly is set to agree to an inquiry in Geneva tonight. But Scott Morrison led the charge for such an inquiry. Some aspects of the Morrison wording have been watered down. So the Chinese embassy puts the boot in again, saying the inquiry will be totally different from what Australia wanted. The motion, as I said, is expected to pass later tonight. The former Cabinet Minister, Matt Canavan, rightly said Australia had been massively vindicated by the, quote, outpouring of support from other countries in the world. Yet even this has provoked more high-handed bully boy behaviour and the sort of behaviour that can't be allowed to prevail. Simon Birmingham is our Trade Minister. He can't even get his ministerial equivalent in China to take his calls. None of this surprises Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, who made a simple comment almost 10 days ago, and I quote, when I made comments about the Communist Party of China in 2017 and 2018, I was hung out to dry by Turnbull, Bishop, Payne, Birmingham and others. And she said, the same group thinkers are still in Cabinet and still in key portfolios. She joins us, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. Senator, good evening. Thank you for your time. So the stuff continued today, and I suppose no surprises here for you.
No surprises, Alan and Peta, good evening. The conduct that we are seeing is very typical of what we have come to expect from the communist regime in Beijing. I mean, let's not forget, this is not a market economy. This is a totalitarian regime, and it is vitally important that we understand this. The other point here is that, let's not forget, Alan, that about a year ago, we allowed 3 Chinese warships to sail into Sydney Harbour. And on the 30th anniversary of the massacre of Tiananmen Square. And what did this show? This showed that they were able to sail into our waters. They were able to do what they like. And I think Peter Jennings and others called this out at the time. This showed that they have they won that psychological contest. So what we are seeing today, the predicament that we are facing today, I think is symptomatic of the attitude that we have taken towards the communist regime, which regrettably has erred on the side of appeasement rather than standing up to often bellicose and illegal actions of the communist regime in Beijing.
Well, Conchetta, to you and both Peter, you see, I had a listener ring me on the radio show the other day and said, Alan, hang on, you can't blame China. This is Australian governments. We've said okay to all of this. They've bought up all the dairy farms in Tasmania. They've bought the avocado farms. They own water. They own beef farms. And then you've got the Port of Darwin. So, Conchetta, what do we make about the Port of Darwin? They've got a 99-year lease.
Well, they've got a 99-year lease. They should never have leased the Port of Darwin. And indeed, I started asking questions at estimates last year about the clauses, the get out of the contract clauses. And I think that the circumstances, particularly security circumstances, are such that we should seriously look at breaking that lease. And indeed, post-pandemic, as you correctly said, it cannot be business as usual. And for that reason, I have advocated for us to look at a plan to decouple from China, to reduce the dependency that we have on the communist regime, but also examine ways that we can look at how we can recover billions or some of the billions of dollars that have been incurred as a consequence of this. But in addition to that,
Peter.
Alan, sorry, I was just going to say it's vitally important, and I think, Peter, you've made this point as well, overhauling the critical infrastructure framework, the foreign investment framework, and most importantly, revisiting the whole issue of the national interest and expanding the framework of that so that we can ensure that our sovereignty is not put at risk.
Yeah, Peter, if I could just ask you, you've been very recently in the bowels of government, and we both know many of these people backwards. Is there sufficient political fortitude in Canberra to respond appropriately to this bullying?
No, not really. There's a big split inside the architecture of the public service and a lot of the politicians in Canberra between those who want us to take all the commercial advantages of China, so shut up and take the money, and those who see China, that there is a line that they should not be able to cross when it comes to the national interest. And that's probably where Andrew Hastie and others sit. I've got to ask the Senator, though, she was on Malcolm Turnbull's front bench, weren't you, and inside the portfolio, I might add, of Foreign Affairs, when the decision was taken in relation to the lease on the Port of Darwin. What was done internally to give this a good look at, Connie?
Well, Peter, I wasn't privy to that, but I think that what's very, very clear is that had the decision been taken today, I think it would have been a very different one. And I think that subsequent to the decision that was taken, I think we saw some changes to the critical infrastructure legislation, which I believe should be tightened up even further. So that's where I think it sits. I do not believe that decision should have been taken.
All right. All right, let me just say to both of you, I'm just wondering where you place the comments by the very respected former Defence and Security official Peter Jennings, who has said, and I quote, China can do what they want, wherever they want, and they'll never be punished for their behaviour because of the veneer of maintaining the relationship. Now, you just alluded to that in your Peter.
Oh, no, Connie, you please go.
No, I think that Peter Jennings is absolutely correct, because what we've seen is this fellow traveller appeasement approach to those who have been directing our foreign policy, as well as those who have been doing business with the communist regime. Therefore, so long as the rivers of gold were flowing, there was a preparedness to turn a blind eye to the skullduggery of the communist regime. Now, whether it's in relation to their activities in the South China Sea, whether it's in relation to cyber attacks, whether it's in relation to what they were doing with their minorities, a whole range of different things that we have seen. And that's why I think that Peta's comments are spot on.
Well, let me just ask you this. I mean, Australia is home to more than 1 million people of Chinese heritage, and they value the liberty and freedom of expression that they enjoy in Australia. Many of them have got strong family ties in China. They expect us to stand up. Now, we're letting them down, aren't we, Peter? I mean, China's not a democracy, as Concetta says. It's a community regime. Its values and beliefs, as you've said many times, are fundamentally different from ours. But, I mean, why don't we sort of acknowledge what the local Australian Chinese community want us to do? Concetta, you first.
Well, absolutely correct. I mean, let's not forget over 1 million people are here of Chinese heritage in Australia. Many of them have come here for the very freedoms that we enjoy. And so therefore, when we are standing up for our values, we're not just standing up for the values of Australians broadly, but we're also standing up for the values of what is a very culturally diverse society. And values and beliefs are very important. And if we are going to have a foreign policy white paper that professes to have a values base to it, well, then we have to be prepared to stand up for that. And that includes not just in words, but in deeds.
All right, well then indeed,
also,
you stepped
just
into...
on that point though, let me be very clear, because I wrote about this on the weekend. I draw a distinction between Chinese Australians who've joined the team, they're permanent residents in this country, or citizens, many of them raising their families, and we know many Chinese in this country go back to the gold rush era, so been here a very, very long time. I draw a distinction between them and those here on temporary visas, students in particular, that roll their visas over for 8, 9, 10 years, buy property in Australia as a bolt hole, a cause, as we see in this case in the University of Queensland, cause a lot of problems on our university campuses, are activists for the Chinese regime. I think we have to be, and they can buy property in Australia. Let me be very clear about that. Established dwellings and yet to be built dwellings. I think we need to be smarter about what we do with temporary visa holders.
Peter, we've got Confucius institutes, for God's sake, in this country. Confucius classrooms funded by China, preaching propaganda in our schools, in primary and secondary schools. I just want to go to Concetta, though. You stepped into the ring at the weekend. You argued that the former Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, failed to stand up to China. You were a junior minister to Julie Bishop. You said the strategy of the government and the Department of Foreign Affairs has been to avoid any criticism of China. Concetta.
Well, when you look at the recent years and you look at the years when we've really seen communist China's activities, particularly China not acting as a good international citizen, we've really seen it in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And that was really the point that I was making. As I said earlier, you tended to have a policy that was practically one of appeasement, preferring to turn the blind eye to the skullduggery so long as the rivers of gold were flowing. And the rivers of gold flowed in all sorts of different ways, whether it's in the business sector or whether it was in the university sector. And we've seen universities overly dependent on students from overseas and are now finding themselves in the financial circumstances where their very viability is in question. And they have been prepared to succumb to the regime that comes with that financing. And of course, as Peter has alluded to, we've seen a very good example of that with the University of Queensland that just we've seen in the last recent days. And of course, don't forget that the Chancellor of the University of Queensland is the former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and was the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs for a long period of time.
It's a can of worms and nest of stress. Before we go, just a quick one to both of you, really. China, put it bluntly, has lied before the world over the coronavirus. It's now in naked bullying with us and other countries. Should there be reparation? The economy, the world, the West has been put into a coma. The economies have been put into... How do we make China accountable for that, Peta?
Well, I think you have to have a fair income inquiry. I'm not so sure we're going to get that. I think the involvement of the World Health Organization is dubious at the very least. I think there's reparations payable if what they did was deliberate. Now, I'd argue from what we can see from afar, it was deliberate, that they deliberately kept things quiet. But it could be that it was just a genuine mistake. I doubt it, but let's say it was. I would be pushing for reparations then. I think as the world, any one of us other countries could be involved at that stake. But look, China has a pattern. It has a very long-term view. It plays the long game. We stupidly play a short game. Parliamentary terms of 3 years in this country. China are working on a much, much longer agenda, and we're only just starting to wake up.
Conchetta, just before we go then, you are in the party room of the government. Your party is in government. How firmly do you believe your party will stand up to the bullies? And do you believe they will be the architects of a world demand to seek reparation or compensation for the economic damage that's been done?
Well, that's why I've been saying that it cannot be business as usual after the pandemic, and that's why I think that it's incumbent on the government to start looking at a plan to decouple from China and also a plan to seek compensation. There was some very good work that was done by the Henry Jackson Society in a publication that they put out, a coronavirus compensation, and they looked at it from the UK's perspective in relation to were there to be a successful claim against China, how damages could flow from that in relation to assets that are held by China in the UK or sovereign debt owed by the United Kingdom to China. Questions about tariffs, all sorts of things. My point is, these are the issues that are within the purview of government to consider. And I think it's incumbent on our government to give serious consideration to examining these complex issues. They are complex, but just because they're complex, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be examined. And that's really where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. It's a good point you make about sovereign debt. Wouldn't it be funny if someone said to China, well, look, I know we owe you all this money, but you've done infinitely more damage beyond what we owe you, and whistle for your money. It'd be very interesting. No, I don't think anyone's got the spine to do all of that. Conchetta,
Senator
Fierravanti-Wells, thank you for your time. Good on you, Peta. Thank you for your time, Senator. Very, very grateful.